O prophet, we have sent you as a witness, a bearer of good tidings, a warner, and as one who calls to God by his permission, and a luminous lamp. So when you hear those titles from Surah Al-Ahzab, verses 45 and 46, think about how we normally engage with an ancient text like that.
Right. We almost instinctively brace ourselves for a theology lesson, you know?
Exactly. We expect a list of spiritual compliments. We assume we're reading a poetic eulogy of a revered founder, just sort of listing off his personal virtues. And it's a very comfortable way to read history, right?
Right.
Because it puts these figures on a pedestal.
It creates a really safe distance. Like, if these titles, witness, bearer of good tidings, warner, caller, luminous lamp, if those are just personal characteristics of one extraordinary person, then they don't demand anything structural from us today.
Yeah, they stay locked up safely in the realm of theology. But in this deep dive, we're looking at the analytical framework of Allama Parwez. And his reading of these verses completely collapses that paradigm. It just destroys it.
It really does. Because Parwez argues that we aren't looking at a eulogy at all. We're looking at a highly specific organizational chart.
An organizational chart. That concept it completely reframed everything for me when I read it.
Right.
Because it means we have to suspend our purely theological reflexes. If you look at your own company's hierarchy or, the constitutional framework of your local government, you aren't seeing poetry. You see operational mechanics, roles, functions.
Exactly. Intended outcomes. Parwez is saying these 5 titles are the architectural blueprint of a society-building project. They are the non-negotiable functions you need to keep any human system alive, just, and functioning properly.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because if I look at this like a corporate restructuring or a constitutional framework, what does a society actually look like when these 5 functions are operating?
Well, to understand the whole machine, we really have to look at how these gears interlock. Parwez presents the prophetic mission not as a mystical event, but as the establishment of an operational model for a socioeconomic structure.
So it's very grounded,
Yeah.
very real world.
Extremely. And if we treat it as a blueprint, we have to start with the first gear, which is defining the function of observation. The very first title laid out in the verse is Shahid, the witness.
Now, the traditional reading of a witness in this context usually leans heavily into the supernatural, right? Like someone watching over humanity to intercede or testify on the day of judgment.
Yeah, that's the standard theological take.
But Parwez pulls this entirely out of the afterlife and just drops it squarely into the socioeconomic reality of the present moment. The systemic observer here is not a passive bystander.
Far from it. The function of the Shahid is to make patterns visible right here and now. It's the active, really rigorous process of seeing what is actually happening in a society.
Stripping away the PR, basically.
Stripping away the cultural narratives, the political spin, all the systemic propaganda, and holding that raw reality up against a standard of objective law.
It sounds kind of like a systemic auditor. Like if an auditor comes into a massive corporation, their job isn't just to watch the money move around.
Right, they have to dig deeper.
Yeah, their job is to identify the glaring discrepancies between what the board of directors says the company is doing and what the financial ledger actually proves is happening.
That's a perfect analogy. And just like an auditor, the position from which they observe is critical. Parwez introduces a geometric analogy here that carries immense philosophical weight.
The circle analogy, right. I love this part.
It's so good. He connects this witnessing function to the concept of the ummah, the community, functioning as the center point of a circle.
Let's really visualize that, because the geometry is doing some heavy lifting for the sociological argument here. So if you draw a massive circle, let's say the outer edge encompasses all of humanity.
Okay, you've got your circle.
The defining mathematically unalterable characteristic of the center point is that it is absolutely equidistant from every single point on that outer edge.
Right. It doesn't matter if you expand that circle to include a small village or a massive global economy, that center point cannot favor one side over another.
Because if it moves, it's not the center anymore.
Exactly. And in Parwez's analysis, this is the ultimate structural metaphor for absolute justice and equality. The witnessing body, the Shahid, must occupy that exact center.
So they can't be a millimeter closer to the wealthy than they are to the marginalized.
No, they can't lean toward one ethnic group, one political faction, or one vested interest. Because if the center shifts even a fraction of an inch, The entire structural integrity of the circle it distorts.
The function of the witness is to maintain that brutal equidistance, like zero bias.
Zero, because that is the only way their observation of the society can be flawlessly accurate.
Yeah.
Think about it. If you are standing closer to the billionaires, your view of the working class is inherently obscured by the billionaire's shadow.
Oh, wow. Yeah, you literally can't see them properly.
Right, you have to stand in the middle.
And there is a massive timeline shift embedded in this framework, too.
Yeah.
Because this role of the equidistant witness wasn't designed to just die with the Prophet Muhammad.
Right, that's the whole point of a blueprint.
Yeah, if this is a blueprint for a human system, the system didn't shut down when the architect passed away.
Exactly. The end of prophethood in this model is essentially the graduation of humanity. The operational function, that heavy burden of being the equidistant auditor, was handed over to the community.
The Ummah.
The Ummah, yes. The Prophet established the system, proved that the blueprint yields real-world results, and then just handed the keys over. Humanity is now tasked with being the overarching observer of global justice.
But wait, I have a major problem with the idea that observation alone is a driving force.
Oh,
Because if I look at modern society, we have watchdogs, right?
sure, we have plenty of watchdogs.
We have human rights organizations producing brilliant, mathematically flawless audits of systemic corruption. They publish a 500-page report detailing exactly how a corporation is exploiting a community. And you know what happens?
Nothing happens.
Nothing. A witness watches a car crash and tells the police. They don't steer the car out of the ditch. So how does a purely observational function actually dismantle a corrupt socioeconomic structure? It feels incredibly passive.
What's fascinating here is that if it were just a dormant report, you'd be absolutely right. It would be entirely static. But a systemic witness doesn't just record history. It weaponizes clarity.
Weaponizes clarity. I like that phrasing.
Think about the mechanics of a massive systemic injustice. How do corrupt structures survive for generations? They don't survive purely through brute force.
No, that's too expensive and exhausting.
Exactly. They survive through obfuscation. They survive through confusion. The first line of defense for a broken system is to normalize the injustice to the point where the people living inside it don't even recognize it as unjust anymore.
They rebrand the exploitation as, just the way the world works.
Yeah.
Or the natural cycle of the economy.
Spot on. You cannot dismantle a systemic flaw until an impartial, equidistant observer cuts through that fog and clearly names the pattern. The Shaheed establishes the absolute, unvarnished reality.
So they turn the lights on in a room that has been dark for centuries. Okay, I see the distinction now. The light itself doesn't pick up a broom and sweep the filth off the floor.
Right.
But until the light is on, people will happily sit in the dirt, assuming it's a carpet. The clarity is the prerequisite for the action.
It creates the inescapable baseline reality, and once that reality is laid bare, the system naturally triggers the next two functions in the blueprint. Because once you see the filth, you have to incentivize the cleanup.
Which moves us from the observation gear right into the incentive structure.
Yeah.
The second and third titles, Mubashir, the bearer of good tidings, and Nadir, the warner.
And again, we are fighting a heavy theological reflex here.
Definitely. The instinct is to read good tidings as a literal mansion in the afterlife and warning as eternal fire.
Right, but Parwez insists we keep our focus strictly on the rational socioeconomic plane. This entire system operates on a mechanism he calls the law of requital.
The law of requital. Let's break down the mechanics of that because it's essentially the fundamental law of cause and effect applied to sociology, economics, and human behavior.
Exactly. It means that every single human action, every piece of legislation, every economic policy produces a natural mathematical result that is perfectly aligned with its nature.
So if a society structures itself around equity, mutual support, and rational law, if it maintains that equidistant center point we talked about, that structural alignment organically produces human flourishing.
Yes, and that flourishing, that societal stability and prosperity is the good tiding, the mubashir. It isn't a magical reward dropped from the sky as a pat on the back. It is the natural yield of a healthy, functioning machine.
So it's like planting an apple seed and getting an apple tree. The tree isn't a reward for planting the seed. It is the inescapable biological consequence of the seed.
That's it, exactly. And the reverse is equally inescapable. If a society operates on hoarding wealth, systemic bias, and exploitation, if the center of the circle shifts to favor the powerful, that deviation mathematically produces diminishment.
Friction, eventual collapse.
Yes, and that collapse is the warning, the not here. The prophetic function here is to make this consequence structure glaringly obvious to the public.
It's an educational mandate, then, teaching humanity that social and economic actions have irreversible natural consequences that you just can't pray away.
Right, you can't cheat the math.
But if these consequences are so natural and mathematical, why does society constantly fight against its own flourishing? I mean, if equity naturally leads to a better world, why do we have thousands of years of recorded history showing humans basically sprinting toward exploitation?
Well, Parwez introduces a specific antagonist here, and it's brilliant because it's not a supernatural demon. It's an active sociological class. He calls them the Akbar Mujrimin.
The elite criminals, the
Yeah.
vested interests.
The elite criminals, yeah, these are the people who sit atop the corrupt systems. They are the ones benefiting from the shifted center of the circle.
And their primary operational goal is to actively conspire to keep society in the dark.
Because the dark is their native habitat, we just established that the Shaheed brings weaponized clarity. The elite criminals are terrified of that clarity.
They despise the light because it exposes their wealth and power for what it really is,
Yeah.
the direct result of someone else's exploitation.
Exactly. They rely entirely on the masses remaining confused, distracted, or, culturally anesthetized.
Because if the room remains pitch black, the elite criminals can keep selling the masses the illusion that the room is a palace rather than a prison.
Yes, and Parwez makes a deeply unsettling point here about what happens to a society that lives under the obfuscation of the Akbar Mujrimin for too long. They undergo a profound psychological degradation.
Oh, this is where he uses the analogy of the bats, right?
Yes. It is one of the most powerful commentaries on cognitive dissonance and systemic conditioning you will ever encounter.
Let's really get into this because it's mind-blowing. Consider the biological reality of a bat. A bat is entirely adapted to the darkness of a cave.
Right. Its whole biology is designed for it.
It navigates by the dark, it finds its sustenance in the dark, and its entire concept of safety is tied to the absence of light. Now, objectively speaking, the sun is the source of all life on Earth.
It provides warmth, it grows food, it sustains the planet.
But if you take a bat and drag it out into the bright midday sun, the bat doesn't experience the sun as a blessing.
Not at all. The bat experiences the sun as pure agony. It blinds them. It disorients them. It threatens everything they understand about survival.
And Parwez argues that when a human society has been exploited for generations, when the elite criminals have so successfully normalized the darkness, the exploitation actually begins to feel like the natural order.
It feels like home.
Yeah. So when the Shaheed and the Mubashir show up and finally flip the switch, bringing the light of justice and the promise of an equitable system, the initial reaction of the masses isn't relief.
They don't applaud, they actually curse the light.
Here's where it gets really interesting. They fight to stay in the cave.
The light disrupts their sleep. It forces them to look at the harsh reality of their own degradation, and confronting that reality is deeply psychologically painful.
So they've been so thoroughly conditioned by the vested interests that they will actively defend the very system that is crushing them.
Exactly.
Which brings us to a massive operational crisis in this blueprint. I want to really play devil's advocate here for a second.
Okay, go for it.
If you have a society that has become like bats, a society that actively fights the light and defends the elite criminals exploiting them, how on earth do you trigger systemic change?
It's the ultimate question.
Right. Because the historical reflex, the instinct of almost every revolutionary movement is coercion. You say, look, these people are brainwashed. They don't know what's good for them. We have to violently drag them out of the cave, force them into the sunlight, and dismantle the elite criminals by brute force.
The vanguard approach.
Yeah. If the billionaires are destroying the world and the masses are too distracted to stop them, why wouldn't you just seize power and force the equity?
Because the moment you use tyrannical compulsion to enforce equity, you have destroyed the very foundation of the system you are trying to build. You have to remember the geometry of the circle we started with.
Oh, right. The absolute core of this socioeconomic structure is the equidistant center point.
And the moment you use force, you become the new oppressor. You shift the center.
You shift the center to yourself. You just replace the Akbar Mujrimin with a new vanguard of elite enforcers.
Exactly. This is why so many violent revolutions simply replace one set of oligarchs with another. Parwez's structural blueprint anticipates this exact pitfall. You cannot force a bat to love the sun by prying its eyes open.
That only causes trauma.
It only causes trauma. So if coercion is mathematically disqualified by the rules of the system, what is the mechanism for waking the bats?
That structural dilemma is exactly what dictates the fourth title in the blueprint. Dai, the caller or the inviter.
And notice the deliberate lack of force in the title itself. It is not the commander or the enforcer. It is the inviter.
And this invitation isn't about, like, emotional manipulation or charismatic persuasion. Parwez is clear that the function of the die relies entirely on basirat, insight, intellect, rational understanding.
Yes, you are presenting the blueprint, laying out the undeniable data of the law of requital and appealing directly to the human intellect.
It is a profound, almost radical display of respect for human agency. The function of the die is voluntary engagement.
Right. You are essentially bringing the audit report from the Shahid, showing the natural consequences from the Mubashir Nadir, and saying, here is the mathematical reality of our current trajectory. Here is the inevitable collapse we are facing, and here's the alternative structure.
But honestly, presenting spreadsheets to a colony of bats still sounds like a losing battle against the elite criminals who control all the megaphones in the cave.
It's an uphill battle for sure.
To make that invitation actually work, to give that rational argument enough power to break through generations of psychological conditioning, you need a very specific kind of tool. You can't just whisper in the dark.
Which is why the operational blueprint culminates in the fifth and final function, the Sirajan Muneera, the luminous lamp.
This is where the framework dives deep into the philosophical nature of truth. The text explicitly compares the system, the Quranic model, the prophetic example, to the sun, deliberately contrasting it with the moon.
And it's a really vital astronomical distinction. Think about the moon. It's passive. It possesses no inherent luminosity. It only reflects light from an external source, meaning its brightness is entirely dependent on its positioning relative to something else.
Human philosophies, political ideologies, cultural trends, these are the moon.
Exactly. They change phases. They rely on the shifting moods of society or the validation of the vested interests to maintain their relevance.
But the sun is self-luminous. It generates its own light from within through its own internal fusion.
In Parwez's framework, the blueprint of this human system is a siraj, a self-generating light. Its logic is internally consistent. It does not require the approval of the Akbar Mujrimin to be true.
It does not need to adapt itself to the darkness of the cave.
No, it simply shines by the sheer force of its own structural integrity.
And what is the fundamental property of light? I mean, think about standing in the middle of a sunlit field at noon. The sun is blasting millions of lumens of light all around you. But the sun cannot force you to see. You can simply close your eyes.
The sun doesn't reach down and pry your eyelids open.
Right. Light does not compel vision. It merely creates the conditions where vision becomes possible. That is the ultimate defining characteristic of the prophetic mission in this organizational chart.
The luminous lamp does not compel belief. It doesn't force the society into alignment. It removes the obfuscation, illuminates the path of equity, and creates the optimal environment for self-determined, rational humans to open their eyes and walk forward.
So the die extends the invitation, and the Sirajan Muneera provides the illumination required to evaluate that invitation.
You stand at the mouth of the cave, you hold the lamp steady, and you basically just have to endure the complaints of the bats, trusting that rational creatures, once they truly comprehend the conditions, will ultimately choose the light over their own exploitation.
But, holding that lamp at the mouth of a hostile cave sounds exhausting. It sounds incredibly dangerous. What if you just want to take the lamp, find a quiet corner of the cave, and enjoy the light by yourself?
Well, this brings us to a scathing critique within Parwez's analysis, and we really need to unpack it. It's a direct assault on the concept of inward-focused, isolationist spirituality, mysticism.
The text draws a stark contrast between the active, socially disruptive light of the Sirajan Muneera and the private, internal light sought by the mystic.
Yeah, there's a famous anecdote reference to illustrate this exact tension, a story of a mystic who achieves ultimate spiritual ecstasy, ascending to the heavens. And he declares that having reached such perfect peace, he would never have chosen to return to the earth.
Like, why would I leave this transcendent state to go back down into the messy, violent, corrupt world below?
Right. To the mystic, the ascent is the final goal. But in this structural blueprint, that attitude is fundamentally useless.
Useless.
Totally useless. An enlightenment that you keep to yourself, a peace you achieve while ignoring the exploitation happening right outside your door, is a total failure of the system.
So what does this all mean? Are we saying the ultimate goal of the prophet wasn't to start a religion where people just pray quietly in their rooms?
If we connect this to the bigger picture, absolutely. Personal salvation in isolation is a myth in this framework. The mandate is aggressive, systemic social justice.
If you find a flashlight in a dark room where people are stumbling around, breaking their legs, and falling into traps set by elite criminals, and your response is to take that flashlight, hide under a blanket, and feel peaceful about your own personal illumination, you aren't a luminous lamp. You're a coward.
The prophetic function is inherently and inescapably social. It demands return. The goal isn't to escape the cave. The goal is to dismantle the cave.
It requires you to take the lamp, abandon the comfort of your private spiritual ecstasy, and walk deliberately down into the most entrenched strongholds of the Akbar Mujrimin.
And that requires an astonishing level of resilience. When you march into the domain of the vested interests carrying a self-luminous lamp, they do not surrender. They actively try to smash the lamp.
Oh yeah, they deploy their resources to convince the bats that the light is actually a destructive fire.
They will use every tool of propaganda to reframe the person holding the lamp as the enemy of society.
Which is why the system demands that the Ummah, the community entrusted with this function, maintains that equidistant, unbiased stance. If they show favoritism, if they compromise the center of the circle, the light dims and the elite criminals win.
Let's pull all these gears together and look at the machine as a whole. We started with 5 ancient words: Shahid, Mubashir, Natir, Dai, Siraj Munir.
Witness, bearer of good tidings, warner, inviter, luminous lamp. By applying Parwez's structural lens, these ceased to be the biographical traits of one man and became the 5 non-negotiable pillars of a functioning human society.
Let's review the mechanism quickly. First, observation the Shahid, the equidistant center point that cuts through obfuscation and accurately audits the reality of the system.
Second, positive incentive the Mubashir, the rational demonstration that structural equity mathematically yields human flourishing.
Third, consequence signaling the Nadir, the unavoidable truth that hoarding wealth and shifting the center inevitably triggers societal collapse.
Fourth, voluntary engagement, the Dai, the absolute commitment to driving change through insight and rational invitation, strictly forbidding tyrannical force.
And fifth, clarity of understanding, the Siraj Muneera, the self-generating, internally consistent framework of truth that eliminates the path out of the cave without forcing anyone to walk it.
It is a flawlessly interlocking architectural blueprint, and the true paradigm shift, the most radical implication of Parwez's analysis, is what this means for the end of prophethood.
Right, because if Muhammad is the operational prototype who built the machine, turned it on, and proved that these 5 gears can successfully dismantle elite exploitation and produce equity, then the blueprint is finished.
There are no missing pages.
The operational manual is complete. You don't need another architect to come down and draw new schematics. The end of prophethood is not the closing of a door, leaving humanity locked outside in the dark. It is the handover of the keys.
It shifts the entire burden of history off the shoulders of a supernatural savior and drops it squarely onto us. It demands immediate systemic action in the present moment.
The community of humanity is now tasked with being the Shahid. We are supposed to be the equidistant center of this circle. We are the ones supposed to be holding the Siraj Muneera and marching into the darkness.
This blueprint provides an incredibly sharp diagnostic tool for any structure you interact with today. Whether you are analyzing a multinational corporation, evaluating the political dynamics of your federal government, or simply looking at the social ecosystem of your own neighborhood, you can overlay these 5 functions and instantly identify where the system is failing.
Exactly. You can look at your local government and ask, who is actually functioning as the witness here? Is anyone maintaining the equidistant center, or has the center entirely shifted to favor the lobbying power of the elite criminals?
You can ask, who is clarifying the natural mathematical consequences of our collective economic policies, and who is actively working to obscure them? Are we using rational invitation to elevate the society, or are we relying on coercion and punishment?
And crucially, who is holding the lamp to expose the vested interests operating in the dark?
It is a staggering operational mandate. We began this deep dive discussing how comfortable it is to read history as a simple list of personal compliments about great individuals. That theological reading demands absolutely nothing of us. It allows us to admire the architect while ignoring the building.
Think about the systems you are a part of today, your workplace, your government, your community. Who is acting as the witness to ensure perfect equality? Who is holding the lamp to expose the elite criminals operating in the dark?
If Parwez is right, a society crumbling under the weight of its own exploitation isn't waiting for a savior to magically descend and clean the room. It is waiting for you to pick up the blueprint and turn the lights on.
The Mashira is fully designed, the gears are perfectly aligned.
The ultimate question the blueprint leaves us with isn't whether the system works. The question is whether we have the courage to operate it.